public inquiry into the questions of who knew what they did at what time and what they did with it cannot be discussed in public, because to understand that fully, you must deal with classified information.
I committed to listening very carefully and abiding by the recommendations that the former Governor General made. We will be following his recommendations.
Okay, that's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau supporting David Johnston's recommendations on foreign interference. The special rapporteur today ruled out a public inquiry. Instead, Johnston said he will hold public hearings on the policy issues he's identified so far. Johnston said he found no evidence the Prime Minister or ministers ignored intelligence or recommendations, but he did identify what he calls serious shortcomings in the way security agencies share and communicate intelligence. And he also takes apart some of the reporting on foreign interference, saying leaked materials were misconstrued in some media reports. And he's now calling on a committee of parliamentarians, NSICOP, and the Intelligence Review Committee and CIRA to review his conclusions and tell the public if they disagree with his findings. Well, we'll see how the Power Panel feels about his findings. Vanguard Strategy CEO Michelle Cadario is here. Shakir Chambers is a principal with Earnscliffe Strategies. Françoise Boivin is a former NDP MP and a political commentator. And the Toronto Star's Joanna Chu, who is also the author of China Unbound. Gang, thanks for joining me on a big news day. Well, Joanna, let's start with you. What's your take on David Johnston's findings and report today?
So I think to a lot of people, it wasn't that surprising he rejected a public inquiry. But I think as far as a PR perspective, perhaps it could have been kind of communicated earlier on that the main impediment to a public inquiry is the fact that confidential intelligence should, and like you said, must remain private. So it was bound, you could see it coming, was bound to all of this hype and public pressure for a public inquiry. As a journalist looking at the narratives, we didn't see that kind of understanding early on that it likely was going to be difficult because of the classified intelligence involved.
Right.
So I also, my colleagues and I have canvassed some reactions, and some of them are from Chinese Canadians, Tibetan Canadians, Uyghur Canadians, and a lot of them are also not that surprised, but also disappointed, because hearing that instead of a public inquiry, there will be public hearings where, they would likely be asked to speak about how they themselves have been targeted by the Chinese state. I think there's a bit of kind of like frustration that this is still at this point where they're basically repeating themselves over and over. Mr. Johnston just had an editorial board meeting with the Star, and he did say that there will be more concrete recommendations coming in his next report in October, including potentially ways to close the legal gaps we have in Canada to fight foreign influence. And this will be 5 months' time, and after that, the Parliament will likely discuss it. So again, there's frustration that this is taking quite some time. And lastly, I think I would just contrast with Australia's experience. They had a series of similar scandals where, intelligence and media reports found some evidence of Chinese government meddling in pretty high levels of politics. And what the Prime Minister did in 2015 was he ordered a top secret probe. And then 2 years later, he unveiled this sweeping suite of legislation to fight foreign influence. And within a year, Parliament, it had bipartisan support, passed these laws. And Australia still has this pretty robust, compared to Canada, laws against foreign influence today. Although it has also faced criticism that this really stringent approach to foreign influence has led to an uptick in anti-Asian racism.
Okay, all right. No, those a lot of good points there. But Michelle, on many versions of this panel, I kept asking, what will happen if the special rapporteur comes back and doesn't recommend a public inquiry? And everybody said there's no chance he's going to not recommend an inquiry. And here we are. So how do you think this plays, Michelle? Will this satisfy the public? It certainly won't satisfy politicians.
No, I don't think so. And, I think that the drumbeat for a public inquiry is going to continue. And on top of that, you're still having public hearings. So you kind of got the worst of both worlds, as a few people have said today, I think. And the idea that a public inquiry can't take place when there's top secret information just isn't true. We've done it. The O'Connor inquiry, who one of my colleagues reminded me about, dealing with Mahar Arar. That judge was, heard testimony from CSIS, from different security agencies, from the RCMP, and he made the determination whether or not things could be made public or not in the national interest, in the national security interest. So it can be done. Mr. Johnston's point that not everything will be revealed and it won't be 100% transparent is absolutely true by the very nature of what they're looking at. I think the only saving grace maybe for the missed opportunity that the Prime Minister had to actually call the inquiry was the missed opportunity that Pierre Poilievre had in terms of actually stepping up and trying to be somewhat prime ministerial and instead of loading out with vitriol about the process and not really saying anything of substance and rejecting being a part of it. So I think that may have been the political silver lining of the day. However, this is just going to roll on and on and on. And I just don't see an end in sight because October comes, the report comes out, and those demands for public inquiry are probably still there.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about how the politicians reacted to this in our next segment. I just want to stick with the report right now, though, if we can, because Shakir clears the political class of government of failing. Essentially, there's no evidence the Prime Minister ignored it, no evidence ministers ignored it. Pretty hard shots at the systemic handling of intelligence inside government, pretty hard shots at the media in terms of some of the reporting, particularly on Handong, for example. What's your high-level takeaway from what we saw today from the Special Rapporteur?
Yeah, so I think on the public inquiry piece, I mean, there's credible evidence. I've seen experts on this show earlier today and some other networks as well talking about the same thing Mr. Johnston said, that you just can't have access to top secret documents. You can't discuss it. So the public aspect of it will never be public. You won't get that information. So I kind of get that. But I think on the political side of things, when I heard his press conference, he really laid no blame at the government. Like you said, he blamed process. He took some shots at the media as well. I think on the political side, there might have been a misread, even on the public mood side. You have all the opposition parties who are obviously calling for a public inquiry. You have credible media outlets who are calling for a public inquiry. And you referenced earlier in your show a Leger poll where I think it's 72% of the public wants a public inquiry. So for him to go against that, I think what happens there is some of the things that you have Mr. Poilievre saying, and even other reporters saying, is Mr. Johnston the right person for the job? And I think this starts to raise some doubts, right? Is he the right person to actually go through this with this process, given the fact that, you can say he's a friend of Mr. Trudeau's in some capacity. And I think not going in the direction where overwhelming support was for that direction, I think it starts to raise some serious questions about should he continue in this role moving forward in this process.
Yeah, Francoise, either it takes some real integrity and backbone to go against the public opinion calling for the inquiry, or you've just put yourself in a completely untenable political position by misreading the mood and misreading the room. I mean, where do you think this is in terms of the recommendation David Johnston came to today?
No, I do think that he knows how to read a room. I think he tried to address those points, and he knew it'd be a moot case anyway. Those who think that he's the best bud and probably babysat Justin Trudeau when he was a toddler will continue believing that, and there's absolutely nothing that will change the mind of people. The surprise is not so much, in my opinion, that he hasn't called for a public inquiry. My surprise at some point in time was that he didn't decide that for the good of the seriousness of the topic, that he might not be no more the person to address the issue. Because I'm with him on the public aspect of the inquiry. I said it from the beginning. I didn't see how a public inquiry could be different than what the mandate was given to a special rapporteur, because it's very different from the O'Connor, from the Rouleau. I kept hearing Jagmeet Singh talk about the Rouleau Commission. Here, your whole commission would be about secret information. It's pretty hard to do a public inquiry on such high-level information. The problem right now is the person who's doing the job. He decided that he would go. Probably anybody else that would have been named, we would have found something about it. And he figured, if I responsibilize, and that's the part I liked really about his report today, because he is kind of putting the onus back into the parliamentarians through the NCCOP and CIRA, just to say, hey, listen, if you don't agree with me not asking for a public inquiry, feel free. I'll give access to all the same information I had, which was more than what the media who started the stories on the topic had. It was partial, and maybe you'll have a different picture. If you see the whole thing, you'll understand more. And if you don't, feel free to say it publicly. So I think there is, if the parliamentarians, and I've been one for a number of years, if they play their role outside of partisanship and just decide to do the job, and no, you don't need to be a special breed, a special kind of person to understand the information that will be given to you and the high level of security that it achieves. So I think as a lawyer, I find his whole report makes sense. What is coming next makes sense also. And from this, we can all grow as a country. Politically, it's always a different story.
Yeah. Politics is always a little bit different. But Joanna, I want to just come back to where this goes next, and the point you mentioned about the diaspora communities who've been warning about this for decades, right? They're not getting the public inquiry, but they are being invited to come back to speak to David Johnston. This is after speaking at committee, speaking on shows like this. I mean, what is the appetite like for that? And do you think we'll actually learn anything new if it's not that formal public inquiry that so many people have been calling for?
It strikes me that the public hearings will be more of a public awareness building exercise. And actually, Mr. Johnston kind of pretty much said as such in his interview with The Star just before the show, that a lot of people aren't aware of things that might put them at risk, that Beijing targets pretty low-level politicians and individuals. So, a public hearing, a lot of it, I wouldn't expect a lot that's new. He did mention that he hopes that our talented national security officials will be able to share their knowledge in the public hearing. So I suspect that there is a lot of frustration around this first report because it focuses on issues such as government culpability and what the government knew when and why it did not act on certain knowledge, like the irregularities that Jagmeet Singh mentioned that Johnston uncovered in his report about Han Dong's nomination. So Conservative MP Michael Chong, the MP who learned from one of these media reports in the Globe and Mail that his family in Hong Kong was targeted by Beijing. He said that even if we take Trudeau at face value, that he did not hear that this had happened to his family, as Prime Minister, you are ultimately responsible for how national security information flows in government. So I think that issue is quite interesting. In Canada, when you compare Canada to other jurisdictions, like the US, obviously, which has a very different framework, Canada is relatively weaker in communications. Former CSIS agents have told me that basically their role they fought it for years was to collect evidence and not really act on it. Basically, they were hoovering up intelligence and weren't necessarily prioritizing communicating this intelligence with the Prime Minister's office, with the government. So I think there's a cultural issue, perhaps a policy issue with CSIS that Mr. Johnston, promises he will delve into further in his second report. But as of now, I think some of, the shots at the media, some of kind of what people see as a clearing of government responsibility, I can see how this can be frustrating to a lot of people while they await, after the summer, they will see more concrete actions maybe. And we also have to remember that the Public Safety Canada is simultaneously working on a foreign agent registry and have been already doing consultations across the country, some in person, some online. I've sat in on some of them with the same actors, with the same people like in the diaspora about foreign influence. So that might come sooner than actually Johnston's second report.
Okay, I want to move on to our next topic on this because Special Rapporteur David Johnston, we've been reporting, says there is no point in having a public inquiry on foreign interference, but the opposition clearly disagrees with that.
Conservatives are not buying it. We need a full public inquiry.
I will be sitting down with the Prime Minister, making it very clear that I disagree with the finding of Mr. Johnston that a public inquiry is necessary.
We're not going to allow the government to silence leaders of the opposition by swearing them to secrecy.
I will be receiving the top secret clearance to get the same information that Mr. Johnston received.
Okay, so should the government bend to the will of Parliament and call that inquiry? We're going to continue that conversation with the power panel. So Shakir, just pick up on that if you can. I mean, Pierre Poilievre, very critical, called him the chalet neighbor, ski buddy, family friend today to pretty much delegitimize the special rapporteur and any of his recommendations. But he also says he will not take him up on the offer to view the intelligence under the limitations of national security laws, but at least that way he could see for himself what the evidence is. What do you make of the Conservative reaction today?
I think this was very predictable. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3 months ago, Mr. Poilievre was offered a chance to see briefings as well, and he rejected it, claiming it was a trap. So I think for him, he wants to keep this alive, and obviously there's a political reason to keep this alive. The more this is in the media, the more this is talked about, it's more content for the Conservatives to kind of attack the Liberals. So it makes a lot of sense. And obviously, the Prime Minister wants to kind of kill this story, right? So you see him leaning into Johnson's recommendations. Go to ETSACOP, go to NSIRA. The facts are there if you want to start to speak about this issue. And I think Mr. Johnston said, don't be willfully ignorant. Prime Minister echoed those words as well. So I think Mr. Poilievre is going to keep doing what he's doing. It's kind of making sure to delegitimize this process. But I think ultimately for both of them, I am not so sure with respect to Michael Chong, with respect to the Chinese diaspora, that this issue actually survives past the summer. I think appointing Mr. Johnston as special rapporteur was a political tactic to kind of delay and take some of the heat off the story. Now that we have this recommendation to do some public hearings in our next report in October, the story's going to die down even more. And I think a lot of folks, unless they're prompted about this issue, don't really speak of this issue top of mind. They're worried about, healthcare, economic issues, cost of living, et cetera. So I think for now, to be quite honest, I think we were complaining about the Liberals not being good at issues management. I think they've managed this issue pretty effectively at this point, and I do think it dies down as we head to the summer and into the fall.
But, Michelle, on the offer, the letters are going out tonight from the Prime Minister's office. Jagmeet Singh says he'll say yes. Pierre Poilievre says he'll say no, to view the confidential annex for the Johnston report. And the rapporteur writes in his report, he goes, while I recognize that in normal political circumstances, an opposition leader may not want to be subject to the constraints of this matter is too important for anyone aspiring to lead the country to intentionally maintain a veil of ignorance on these matters. Them's fighting words to some degree. I mean, what do you make of that stance by David Johnston in his report?
Yeah, it was a bit of a shot that I was surprised to see in that report, although it would be exactly what I would say, to be honest with you. This is a circumstance where I actually think it's genuinely a missed opportunity for him. He is the opposition leader, yes, but first he's a parliamentarian. He was elected by Canadians to represent them and to actually help the government to actually function and to help. And his role is to oppose in most circumstances, but it's not to actually ignore facts or to just put your head in the sand and pretend that, there's no information out there to know anything more. That blindfold ignorance is somehow a defense about just going and railing about things that, probably aren't true. So I think that for a person who actually wants to be Prime Minister, it was surprising how un-prime ministerial his response was. In contrast to Jagmeet Singh, who actually put out a thoughtful response. He disagrees with what the government is doing and the approach that the government is doing. He wants a public inquiry, but I thought his response was measured, and he was respectful of Mr. Johnston, but at the same time making his point that he disagreed with the decision of the government. And he's taking the responsibility to actually get sworn in, to have access to the information so that he's not out there and just, blindly ignorant. So I applaud him on that.
But, Francoise, Jagmeet Singh says he's going to use every tool available to him to get a public inquiry out of the Prime Minister. We had a long conversation about what is and isn't in his toolbox. But, he's the guy who can force this. He has the leverage to do it. Right now, he doesn't seem intent on doing it, but he is going to take the Prime Minister up on his offer to look at the intelligence. Is he making a mistake doing that? As Mr. Poilievre says, is he falling into a trap, or is this a smart move by Jagmeet Singh to see the facts for himself?
I'm actually with Michelle on that point. I think every leader of every political party should accept the offer. It's rare; they don't do it often, and who's supposed to be against having information? Information, guys, is everything in politics, except if you want to say just about anything about everything, and who cares about the truth or the facts or so on and so forth. So that's pretty much the message that Pierre Poilievre conveyed to me today, was that I don't want the information. I want to be able to say just about what comes to my mind. That's basically, once people have time to think about the refusal, we'll start thinking. Pierre Poilievre doesn't want the information. He doesn't want the facts. He doesn't want to deal with facts. And it's one thing to say that you cannot divulge the highly secure information. It's another thing to say, I will take this government into account by asking questions on process, on what to change, on what to do, and say, without saying the content, there's ways to do so to make the file advance. So I think he's missing an opportunity, but willfully, because he can't handle the truth. And that would be a problem for him. Yves-François Blanchette from the Bloc Québécois was no better today, because his first tweet coming from the decision, right after we all knew about the inquiry not being a public one, spewed stuff on Twitter that was, in my view, not very dignified for a leader of a big group of parliamentarians. So I do hope they reflect, because we'll all be better if our leaders of all political parties represented in the House of Commons have the same information to make the decision or try to address some issues, instead of talking in the air and talking without knowing what they're talking about.
So Joanna, you obviously know what you're talking about in this, because you've written more about this, just about anybody in the country, I think, including in your book. You've spoken to a lot of people who've been targeted by the regime back in China. I mean, how do you think they're viewing the political debate on this as it's unfolding in Parliament? Do you think the people who are feeling the foreign interference pressure the most feel like it's being taken appropriately, seriously here in Ottawa?
On the one hand, I think a lot of these people think a public inquiry keeps up the public pressure on the government to take action, but they find, Pierre versus Trudeau versus Singh all very distracting and worrying, because it might overshadow, this debate over who's to blame, or what did Trudeau know? Why did he drop the ball? They just want to see action taken. They want to see some sort of change, so that when they show up at police stations saying their family members are threatened, or actually someone from the Chinese consulate showed up on their doorstep to threaten them, or called them in their hotel room, that police would actually know what to do, and that there will be some mechanism to protect them, some mechanisms for intelligence sharing between CSIS and different levels of government that Mr. Johnston himself has criticized for just not being there, even at high levels. So there's a lot of frustration, and I think people want to see actual concrete change happen, but also a lot of people are realists, and they know that national security is not necessarily known as Canada's strong suit, that we're not known to act really quickly on these issues. And some people feel optimistic that at least in this past year, perhaps because of these unprecedented controversial media leaks, that more action is being taken on this file than otherwise would have happened. So some see a silver lining, that we might see things like a foreign agent registry that's looking pretty likely, and they say that this will increase transparency. So the average politician can look up a group and might be able to find out if they're connected to a foreign state. If there's any more intelligence sharing with the police that could allow more prosecutions to happen. Right now, there really aren't a tradition of prosecuting foreign agents' intimidation in Canada. There's not really those cases. So I think people who are kind of being realistic about it think that, given how distracting and chaotic some of this might be, if we still see some changes, by the end of the year, it will still be better off than if those media leaks, if that leaker from CSIS had never gone to media, that we will end up better off.
So Shakir, on that point, I mean, it's not the process a lot of people wanted, right? It's not a public inquiry, but David Johnston will lead public hearings. They will make recommendations on reforming things. Is there enough time between now and Halloween, to do an effective assessment and overhaul of all of this stuff?
That's a great question. I mean, is there enough time between now and the next election to actually implement any changes? And I think that's where you start to have these questions, right? Heading into the next election, which could be as early 2024, can we actually have processes in place that give people confidence in our democracy, confidence in our institutions? And I think the verdict is still out on that one. So we'll see how fast Mr. Johnston can move, and depending on what he recommends, how fast we can actually implement those changes. But I think going into the next election, we need to ensure that Canadians do have confidence in this process. Voter turnout is already pretty low in our country. I think we don't need anything else to kind of deter voters from casting ballots come election time.
Okay, gang, we'll definitely talk about this on October 31st, but I think we'll talk about it between now and then, too. I want to thank the Power Panel. Joanna Chu, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Françoise Boivin, Shakir Chambers, and Michelle Cadaria. Thanks, gang.